It was a bright morning at the prestigious U.S. Military Academy. Rows of young cadets stood tall in formation, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their eyes fixed forward. Suddenly, the commandant, Colonel Davis, barked out a single, strange order. The words echoed across the parade ground, sharp and unfamiliar. The cadets froze. Confused glances darted left and right. No one moved. Not a single cadet seemed to know what to do. And then, from the shadows of the far edge of the field, a janitor in faded overalls slowly lowered his broom. His posture straightened, his eyes sharpened. In a single crisp motion, he snapped to attention, perfectly executing the command. The entire parade ground fell silent. The young cadets shifted uneasily in their formation, the crisp rhythm of the parade ground suddenly broken. Their brows furrowed, their polished boots scraped faintly against the gravel as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The janitor, an old man with gray hair tucked beneath a worn cap, stood tall and rigid. His broom, forgotten at his side, leaned against the fence. The transformation had been almost unnatural. A moment ago, he had been invisible, another faceless worker tending to the academy grounds. Now he was a figure of discipline, posture locked, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward with unshakable focus. It was as if time itself had shifted. Whispers began to ripple through the rows of cadets. "Wait, he knew it?" one cadet hissed, glancing nervously at his neighbor. "How? He's just the janitor," another muttered. "Maybe he guessed," a third offered, though even as he said it, he knew there had been no hesitation in the old man's response. Colonel Davis's eyes sharpened. He had not expected anyone, not even his top-ranked cadets, to recognize the obscure command. It was a maneuver, a drill, that hadn't been formally practiced in decades. No one should have known it, no one except a man who had lived it. But the one who had answered wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't adorned with medals or a polished insignia. He wore faded overalls and carried the smell of soap and dust. His life seemed bound to corridors, mop buckets, and silent hallways. And yet he had moved with the certainty of a soldier. A few cadets, too young to recognize dignity, began to laugh. At first it was nervous, short bursts of disbelief. Then, emboldened by the group, it grew sharper. "Sir, with respect," one cadet finally spoke up, his tone carrying the arrogant edge of youth. "That's just old Reed. He cleans the mess hall. He's not one of us." The words lingered in the air like a stain. A couple of cadets chuckled, shifting their weight smugly. The old man did not move. He did not flinch. He stood rooted, the lines of his face steady, his gaze unwavering. To him, the laughter was no different than the chatter of crows. Background noise. But behind his eyes weathered and lined by years of hardship, something flickered. A memory, a battlefield, boots sinking in mud, the crack of distant gunfire, orders shouted above the chaos. Inside him, old instincts stirred. Outside, he remained still, his dignity intact. Colonel Davis stepped forward. His boots struck the ground with authority, each step silencing another ripple of laughter. His gaze swept the cadets until it landed on the one who had dared to speak. "Cadet Miller," he barked, voice cutting through the air like steel. "Do you know what that order meant?" The cadet faltered. His earlier bravado wavered under the colonel's glare. No, sir," he admitted, his voice shrinking. The colonel's expression hardened. "That's because you've never lived it." He turned his head slightly, his eyes flicking toward the janitor, who stood like a statue. "But he has." The words struck like thunder. The laughter evaporated. A heavy silence settled over the ground. Cadets glanced at one another, confusion etched across their young faces. Could it be true? Could this man, the one who swept their halls, who mopped their spilled coffee, who blended so seamlessly into the background, have once been someone of importance? The old janitor, Thomas Reed, remained silent. His hands, calloused from years of cleaning, had once carried rifles, guided men through chaos, and borne the weight of responsibility that few could understand. Yet he had never spoken of it. Now in this moment, his silence said more than words ever could. Colonel Davis's voice dropped lower, losing its thunder but gaining gravity. "Step forward." The janitor hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then, with the same precision he had once commanded on battlefields, he took his first step. The sound of his worn boots against the stone carried more power than any parade march. The cadets straightened unconsciously, as though instinctively recognizing the authority in his stride. He stopped at the front, standing eye to eye with the colonel. Lines of age carved his face. The colonel's posture was iron. The old man drew in a breath. His voice, when it came, was firm, steady, and resonant enough to fill the silent courtyard. "Sergeant Major Thomas Reed." The words landed like cannon fire. The cadets shifted, their jaws slack, eyes widening. Sergeant Major? That was no janitor's title. That was a warrior's title, a leader's title. Colonel Davis blinked, searching the man's face. "Reed, Reed." He repeated under his breath, as if the syllables carried an echo from his own past. And then recognition dawned. His voice grew quieter. "The 82nd Airborne." Reed's eyes hardened, but they gleamed with memory. "Yes, sir. 25 years of service, tours in deserts, jungles, and mountains. Nights colder than bone, days hotter than steel. I bled with my brothers. I buried them, too. And I never forgot a single order, especially not the one you just gave." Gasps swept the cadet ranks. For them, war was still an abstract, words in history books, tactics on paper. But this man had lived it. He had carried the weight of choices that textbooks could never capture. As Reed spoke, his mind slipped into the past. He remembered the roar of engines as choppers lifted men into the night sky. He remembered the acrid sting of smoke and sandstorms that blinded the eyes but not the will. He remembered the voices, young voices, not so different from these cadets, calling out, "Sergeant Major!" "What now?" And his own steady reply, "Forward, always forward." The memory burned, but he did not flinch. He carried it like he carried everything else, in silence, with dignity. Back in the present, one of the cadets whispered, unable to help himself, He was one of them." A legend. Colonel Davis squared his shoulders. His sternness remained, but respect now underpinned it, deep and undeniable. "Why didn't you ever say anything, Sergeant Major? Why let them think you were just a janitor?" Reed's gaze swept over the cadets, those same young faces that had mocked him, ignored him, dismissed him as invisible. His voice came quiet but carried a steel edge. "My service ended. My duty to the flag was fulfilled. I traded my uniform for these overalls because this academy still needed me, in a different way. These halls, these grounds, these cadets, they all needed to be kept standing. I didn't need to tell them who I was. My broom was just as much a service as my rifle had been. But when I heard that command again, I remembered, and I couldn't stay silent." The cadets stood motionless, shame and awe mingling in their young eyes. They had spent years walking past a man who had been more soldier than all of them combined, and never once did they see him. The colonel's jaw tightened. He looked at his cadets, then back at Reed, and gave a single, deliberate nod. "Understood, Sergeant Major." At that moment, the balance of the entire academy seemed to shift. The janitor was no longer invisible. He was the embodiment of what every cadet claimed to aspire to: discipline, sacrifice, honor. The courtyard was silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Finally, the colonel thundered, "Let this burn into your memory. Discipline and respect are not stitched into uniforms. They are lived. They are carried in silence, in sacrifice, in humility. This man has more soldier in his stride with a broom than some of you have with a rifle." The cadets straightened, their pride pierced but their hearts awakened. One cadet, voice trembling, stepped forward. "Sergeant Major, I'm sorry. We didn't know who you were." Reed's eyes softened. "Respect isn't about what you know," he said. "It's about how you treat people, whether you know their story or not." His words hit harder than any punishment. The colonel gave a final nod. "You may not wear the uniform anymore, Sergeant Major, but you remind us all why we put it on." The next morning, Reed was back with his broom and bucket, humming softly as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the cadets were never the same. They greeted him with salutes, respect, and questions that carried more weight than drills. His wisdom shaped them in ways no textbook could. Years later, those cadets would carry his lesson into their own commands, remembering the day an old janitor taught them the true meaning of honor. And so, in the Academy's history, that morning became legend, not of punishment or humiliation, but of revelation, a reminder that greatness often hides in plain sight.